Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update to the Ontario Provincial Election Series. Woo! I will note, this is a channel note. This is my last one while I am not at my usual filming location, so if there's a bit extra, if there's some missteps in editing at the beginning and end of videos, that will be done with after today. I'm not very good at editing. That's why I generally do these in one take. My editing skills are awful. That said, let us dig into where we are. So, as has been really happening the last couple of weeks, there's an oscillation between about low 90s and mid 80s and low 90s for the Progressive Conservative seat totals, and the Ontario Liberals and Ontario NDP keep kind of vacillating around. The Hamilton numbers, I think, are starting to look a bit more reasonable. I'm a bit more confident in this, though I'm still not that confident in it. And Toronto downtown is still a total free-for-all between the Liberals and the NDP. This could go either way pretty easily, including some of these ones currently held by the PCs. They could easily go to one of those two parties if there's more consolidation between the two of them. Though the cities in southern Ontario, like Waterloo, Waterloo, London, those are unlikely to consolidate. Unless the NDP gains ground, it's unlikely the Liberals would be able to take them because they're very far behind in the back. And same thing in the north. Though we're also seeing this federally now where Northern Ontario seems to be sliding Conservative and also seems to be sliding Conservative provincially. So I think that's not a coincidence there. I suspect a lot of these non-primary urban centers are, like London and such, are sliding away from the more left-wing parties because they seem to only really care about the really big cities in whatever province you're from. In this case, Ontario, they really care about Toronto and maybe to a lesser extent the adjacent suburbs, like of the rest of the GTA. But outside of that, they don't really seem to care. At least the policies I've seen the Ontario Liberals and Ontario NDP come up with, like, they're not completely nothing for the rest of the Ontario, but they seem very focused and catered towards the very urbanist of Ontario, which I think is hurting them in the rest of the province. And ironically, it does really hurt them electorally because they are competing heavily against each other. And interestingly enough, you do see some commentators about this election complaining that, first past the post sucks because look at this. The Ontario PCs are going to gain more seats with lower vote share. Somehow, in a way, insinuating that first past the post is undemocratic or unfair. Completely ignoring the fact that if we group the NDP, Liberals, and Greens together as one broad faction, which is inaccurate and wrong, you should not do that, which is the same mistake these commentators are making. But if we accept their premise and we group their opposition parties together and say these are an interchangeable voting bloc, they've lost 7% vote share compared to 2018 right now. About 51%, whereas in 2018 they finished with 58%. So yes, the PCs are down, I believe, 3.5%, but their opposition is down 7%. So naturally, you would expect, given those numbers, you would expect the PCs to do slightly better because they've actually lost slightly less vote share. And then once you consider these are three actual other parties and it's not two blocks, then it makes even more sense. It's not the Ontario PC's fault that left-wing Ontarians don't understand how first past the post works because their parties lied to them. Oops, now, okay, that's a bit hyperbolic on my end. Like, there's technically working properly, but people moaning that, oh no, our vote split is so vote split. We're losing. Well, maybe you should try to consolidate your vote. Just saying. This would happen in a lot of systems, too. Now, you could argue that if this was run in, let's say, a runoff system, the PCs would probably lose but that's really because the runoff system does not. Canada is essentially like a one-party, would fall into the one-party state model in a runoff system. I have a video separate for that, in case you're curious. But in a runoff system with how Canada's politics are structured, the Liberal Party would almost win 100% of the time how the politics are structured. So, if you want one party state to run off, is great for you, or instant runoff as well. Same problem. So, and then you also get this naivety that these are the vote shares under first past the post. These would be the vote shares under proportional, so therefore the NDP should get 22% of the seats and the PC or Liberal should get 27%. No, that's not how that works. Because if this was a proportional election, first off, if the seat threshold is like 5%, you would see twice as many parties. You'd have at least 8. I don't think there's a single country that has a 5% vote threshold that doesn't have 8 parties, unless you're talking about the last Hungarian election, where all of the opposition except 2 decided to form together, even though it doesn't make any sense. You had literal communist and hard right, maybe fascist, maybe just social conservative, though it's kind of murky with Jobbik. I'm not Hungarian, so I don't really know the intricacies, but I know in the past they were actually a fascist party. I'm not 100% sure right now. But we're not talking about Hungary. So we're talking about Ontario. So I think here is really just people moaning that the vote is heavily split among the left, and for some reason, well, not for some reason, pride is getting in the way of them fielding a real challenger. Like Del Duca, I don't think is really going to be able to get above 30. I just don't think he's the charismatic enough person. I don't think he is an interesting enough person. And I don't think he has the force of presence. I guess in this case, charisma does mean more force of presence than like ability to like persuade people or be likable. He just doesn't have the qualities to really motivate people to vote for him. And Horwath is just so long in the tooth. She's been here for, 16 years now? You can correct me if you're wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, Ontarians, but from what I've seen, or what I recall, she's been 4 elections now. So, very long in the tooth. Has had pretty poor performances in most elections. And she's doing even worse now than, I think, her first one. I had to double check that one, but that's neither here nor there. And the other thing to keep in mind too is even if we do this silly rationalization that we can group these 3 parties as one party, then we're also ignoring Other and the New Blues and the Ontario Party, who make up the rest of the vote share. Others, probably dozens of candidates. Those parties together would make this almost 50-50 race. And if you're talking about that, then yeah, maybe the seat totals are going to be slightly different, but you're talking about a very different election. Even if you're talking about proportional system, it would be pretty close to 50-50. You'd probably have really unstable government too, because you would have a lot of different parties. You'd have a lot of small parties, and the left would have a terrible time forming a coalition government, a lasting coalition government, because the NDP and the Liberals are about the same strength. If you look at countries who have coalitions in proportional systems, systems that have parties of similar strength always do really bad. Just 2 examples. Italy has extreme government instability because they have a bunch of parties, left and right of the spectrum, who are roughly the same size. So it's very difficult for a government coalition to stay stable because there's different parties who are about equally strong in the coalition. Comparatively, you look at Germany, either the SPD-run or CDU-run governments, the SPD or the CDU dominate the government, and then you just have a few smaller parties propping them up. So that's much more stable. And ironically, the right, in this case, assuming there was a coalition between the Progressives, Ontario Party, and New Blue, assuming all their vote share is accurate, that would be a fairly stable government, interestingly enough. So there's a lot of nonsense to that, and really, I think there is going to be a lot of nonsense because I think a lot of commentators and people on the left in Ontario, or in Canada in general, have already written off the election as a throwaway that they've lost, which is silly. I think it's a really dumb thing to do, An election's not lost until you give up or the election day occurs. As long as you keep campaigning, you keep trying, you keep convincing people, or at least attempting to convince people, you will eventually, you could eventually succeed. As soon as you stop trying, you can't win. So that's a very daft way to look at things. But it seems to be how people are looking at things. Say la vie. Now, what does it put us here? Well, as I said before, unless there is more consolidation between the Liberals and the NDP, it's going to continue to be like this until the Ontario Centre, is tired of the Progressive Conservatives. In which case, then the Liberals could theoretically win by default. But until the Ontario populace is tired of the PCs, which historically has never been after one term unless they've done a really, really bad job, and by all accounts, Ford has done a thoroughly mediocre job. I cannot think of anything he did that every other premier didn't do. I'll rephrase that. I cannot think of anything he did poorly that other premiers didn't also do poorly. Some people on the right will point to his COVID response, but pretty much every single premier had a terrible COVID response to a right-winger, so that's not unexpected. And to a left-winger, the same thing, actually. I think pretty much everyone would agree most premiers had a terrible COVID response. Either they weren't harsh enough or they were too harsh. I don't think there's very many people who were like, they did a good job. Maybe in like a post-traumatic, you want to forget about it, so you're just kind of ignoring it view, you might be like, fine, I didn't die. Or I didn't know anyone who died. I wasn't sick. But there's a lot of the response in general, and to date, still, has been really poor, I think, for most governments. And I think most people will agree with me, regardless of which side of poor you think it is. Was it too little or too much? I think most people agree it was poor. How? To what degree? That's up for debate. But with that, since he's thoroughly mediocre, and I can't think of anything he's done particularly bad, and maybe my Ontario viewers could correct me, I might be missing something, but he had a bit of a rocky start, but he just seems mediocre. And especially compared to Trudeau nationally, he hasn't had any of the scandals, at least publicly known scandals, or even to another premier, my own premier in Nova Scotia, the last one, Ian Rankin. He was rocked by a scandal for having 2 drinking and driving charges and 1 conviction. The other one was off on a technicality, I think. That's a huge scandal. I can't think of a single one that I've heard of about Doug Ford. And you would assume if he had a big one, it would have been brought up by now. Maybe my media that I'm seeing on the election is not covering everything. That's always a possibility, because you have to, when you're talking about reading election media, people will, all the news apps and all that crap you use these days to get news will filter things to your perspective, so you often lose things from the other side, which is really frustrating. Now, that said, I will agree, most people will probably be crowing in the comment section and be like, oh, but reading the other side is so annoying. And yeah, because a lot of papers these days are garbage, left-wing or right-wing. There's very few news publications I consider very good. A lot of them are... the problem is, I think a lot of them just go full op-ed and don't even try to report the news. And I don't really care about your op-ed, to be honest. I want to know about what's going on in the election, not what you think is going on in the election, if you know what I mean. Like, yes, this video is like 50% report. It's like 25% report, 50% op-ed. I try to keep the report in the beginning of the video. So then if you don't care about my opinion, you can just log off after seeing my prediction. Let me know at any point if you think I'm getting into opinion too quickly, and I'll keep that in mind. But I try to keep the opinion to the second half. And the opinion I have is actually based off of the data and the news coverage I'm seeing. So it's not strictly opinion. Like, I try not to preach and say which candidate I think is best. I just try to say what's going on in the campaign and why we're seeing these trends. I might make a different video series where I talk about actual preferred candidates and stuff like that. But in this series, I do my absolute best to just talk about what's going on in the campaign trail and how that seems to be affecting the campaign and the polling based off of polling data, based off of news information, stuff like that. I don't, as always, if you think I'm not doing a good job with that, comment below, point out where you think I'm being too biased or too unbiased, and I will comment on that. And I will be honest, I'll be upfront, I do have an obvious bias, and if you watched any of my live streams, it would be immediately obvious. And I don't think it is wrong to be biased, but I want to make sure everyone understands where my bias is and what I'm trying not to be biased. In this case, I am just trying to report how the polling is going and how the trend is going. Though it gets more opinion later in the video and less opinion early in the video, if that makes sense. So let me know if at any point you think I'm not doing a good job of that. But overall, I think we're still at the exact same point. Unless one of the opposition parties, the NDP or the Liberals, break through, this is going to be a complete rout for the PCs because we're at peak vote splitting again. 31 seats returned for the opposition. 32, technically. Peak vote splitting. And if you look at all the polls are reporting NDP 24 to 26, and the Liberals, I believe, 26 to 30. If they get roughly the same vote total, about, let's say 24%, if they both get there, huge rout. It'll be peak vote splitting. They're done. Right now, we're pretty close to peak vote splitting. I just don't really see it going, assuming the polling is correct, and assuming nothing really changes. We've had one debate and nothing really seemed to have changed following that debate. I don't see the, what's the word for it? The NDP or Liberals being able to win. I do not see a path for them to victory. You look at vote shares. The Liberals' vote share is stuck in Eastern Ontario, the city of Toronto, and a little bit to the GTA. The NDP vote share is stuck in, generally speaking, Southern Ontario and Toronto these days. They're some weeks they're really good in the north, some weeks they're terrible in the north. It's kind of hit or miss. And even in general, Southern Ontario, their vote share is extremely concentrated to just Waterloo, Kitchener, London, and Windsor. Outside of those three cities, so about 8 ridings, they have almost 0 points. And if we go include like Hamilton, Niagara area, outside of Niagara and Hamilton itself, 7 seats, they have almost nothing. So Southern Ontario as a whole, I think is like 40 seats and they are competitive in 15. Not particularly great for them. In fact, they could win all 15 of those competitive seats for them, and the PCs would still win a large majority. Let that sink in for a second. In a lot of ways, the story of this campaign is actually more that the NDP have collapsed in Northern Ontario than anything. Because every single poll has them doing worse than they did in, 2017 or 2018. In fact, we can look at data here. So in 2018, they got 44% in the north. Since I started tracking April 19th, they've not had one projection where they were close to 44%. In fact, right now they're 20 percentage points below. Yikes. This election, if it does not lead to Horwath stepping down or being removed, I think is more of a slight to the NDP than it is to anything else. Right now, she's set to walk away with 14 seats, which I believe is a net loss of 25. A 22% decrease in vote share. and her main opponent, Doug Ford, gaining seats. I do not see how she could possibly stay leader after this. Del Duca, if this performance is how he does, I could see him staying on. He's gained 10 seats. He's gained about 8 percentage points of the popular vote. That is a reasonably good outcome for someone who was walked away, or for the party that walked away in 2018 with 7 seats and 19% of the vote. Doug Ford, if he wins this, he's solid. In a way, the only interesting thing that could come out of this election, other than Horace possibly getting removed from office, or from leader of the party, is if we see the Ontario Party here, or the New Blue Party here, become a real player in Ontario politics. Or will they go away like I believe it was the Trillium Party in 2018 that disappeared after the election? Maybe. I don't think we should discount the possibility that these are just one-round protest parties spurred by the COVID pandemic. But what if they're not? What if they stay? That, I think, is the big wrinkle. And I think that heavily depends on how good they show up. How good they do in the election. Right now, if we go back to this, they're not set to keep a single seat. And right now, each party does have 1 seat, technically. If, and this is a big if, they can walk away with a seat, they might stay as a real force. We'll see. Though I will note, from personal experience in Nova Scotia, someone who no one thinks will win can easily win their seat. In the case of the last provincial election, the provincial PC party in June of last year removed an MP for Northern Nova Scotia. Like central, it doesn't matter. Most people won't know what the riding is. Named Elizabeth McCrossan. No one thought McCrossan, who tried to run again in the 2017 or the 2021 election, would be able to win her seat back. Because there was running a PC candidate against her and all this other stuff. In fact, not only did she win her seat back, she won more vote share with a PC spoiler against her than she did the last election. Not even just more vote share, more raw votes. So, you can have a situation like this where you have a candidate that no one expects to win. No one projects to win. And in fact, is frankly impossible to project unless you get riding level data. You can get these candidates and they can actually win. And the tricky thing with these candidates is most polling doesn't ask people whether you're voting for your local candidate or if you're voting for the party. And that, especially in the case of like the Ontario, the New Blues, they could be a situation where the New Blues, almost their entire vote share is people voting for Miss Carriolos? Can't think of her name. Hope I pronounced that properly. Could be almost all of that. In which case, she could easily win her seat back. But we don't know, because we don't have the local riding data, or at least I don't know, because I don't have the local riding data. Maybe someone has polled it, but I don't have it. And even if I did have it, I'm not even really sure how I would use it. I have some thoughts in my head, but I'd have to actually experiment with a bit. But that's neither here nor there. And really, I guess to sum this up, right now, we have about 19 days to the election, just a bit over 2 weeks. And for the life of me, I cannot see the NDP or the Liberals turning this around. It's not impossible. By all means, they could. But I do not see it. I don't see their path to victory. And in fact, assuming they don't have a path to victory, the more interesting thing is, can Horwath do good enough to convince people to keep her on? And will the Ontario Party or New Blues last a relevant amount of time? But with that, I bid you all adieu. And if you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below. Anything you want to say at all. I love reading the comments. They're fantastic. And please share. Helps the channel quite a lot. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you Tuesday with something different.